the mist-shrouded valleys of northern Maine, where ancient pines whisper secrets older than memory itself, there once stood a manor house that would become synonymous with darkness. The Ravencroft estate, built in 1834 by shipping magnate Cornelius Ravencroft, was intended as a monument to prosperity and refinement. Instead, it became the epicenter of a family curse so malevolent that even today, nearly 2 centuries later, local residents cross themselves when speaking the name Ravencroft. The estate's imposing Gothic architecture, with its towering spires and gargoyle-adorned facades, seemed to emerge from the very earth like some primordial nightmare made manifest. But it was not the forbidding exterior that would earn the Ravencroft name its place in the annals of American horror. It was what transpired within those cold stone walls over 7 generations of increasingly depraved inhabitants that would transform a family legacy into a cautionary tale of absolute corruption. Before we delve deeper into this tale of ancestral evil, I must ask those of you listening tonight, are you prepared to confront the darkest corners of American family history? The story I am about to unfold contains elements so disturbing that they have been deliberately obscured from historical record for over a century. If you have the fortitude to hear this account through to its chilling conclusion, then steel yourself for a journey into the very heart of hereditary madness. The Ravencroft family's descent into darkness began not with Cornelius, the patriarch who built the estate, but with his son Jeremiah, who inherited both the family fortune and what would prove to be a terrible compulsion toward cruelty. Born in 1815, Jeremiah displayed disturbing tendencies from an early age. His childhood tutor, a scholarly man named Edmund Whitmore, kept detailed records of his young charge's behavior, records that would later be discovered hidden within the estate's vast library. The boy shows an unusual fascination with suffering, Whitmore wrote in an entry dated October 1827. Today I discovered him in the garden, methodically pulling the wings from captured butterflies while observing their struggles with what I can only describe as scientific detachment. When questioned about this behavior, he looked at me with those pale gray eyes and simply stated that he was studying the nature of pain. As Jeremiah matured, his interests evolved from insects to larger prey. The estate's extensive grounds provided ample opportunity for experimentation, and the family's wealth ensured that any unfortunate incidents could be quietly managed. Local farmers began reporting missing livestock, always discovered days later in conditions that defied explanation. The animals had not been killed for food or fur, but seemed to have been subjected to prolonged torment before death finally claimed them. The young heir had become convinced that true understanding of existence could only be achieved through the systematic exploration of agony, both physical and psychological. His private journals, written in a cipher that would not be decoded until the 1920s, revealed the depth of his philosophical perversion. "Pain is the great teacher," one entry read. "It strips away all pretense, all false comfort, revealing the raw truth of our mortal condition. Through careful application of suffering, one can achieve a clarity of perception impossible through any other means." Jeremiah's marriage to Constance Blackwood in 1842 marked the beginning of the Ravencroft family's true horror. Constance, a delicate beauty from a financially struggling Boston family, had been drawn to Jeremiah's wealth and apparent refinement. What she discovered on her wedding night would transform her from a hopeful young bride into a hollow-eyed specter haunting the estate's corridors. The wedding guests, who had celebrated late into the evening, retired to their chambers with no knowledge of the nightmare beginning just floors above them. Constance's screams echoed through the manor's stone walls for 3 consecutive nights, though Jeremiah had taken care to ensure that the sounds would not carry beyond the family quarters. When she finally emerged from the master bedroom on the 4th day, her transformation was complete. The vibrant young woman who had walked down the aisle had been replaced by a creature of such abject terror that even the hardened household staff whispered prayers when she passed. Constance bore Jeremiah 3 children over the next 5 years. Mordecai in 1843, Lucretia in 1845, and Damien in 1847. Each birth was attended by circumstances that the local physician doctored, and the children emerged into the world bearing marks that suggested their gestation had been anything but normal. And their early development confirmed the worst fears of those who witnessed it. Mordecai, the eldest, displayed his father's cold intelligence combined with an even more refined cruelty. By age 7, he had established what he called his laboratory in the estate's abandoned East Wing, where he conducted experiments that would have impressed university researchers had their subjects not been living creatures captured from the surrounding countryside. His systematic approach to inflicting suffering showed a sophistication that belied his tender years. Lucretia, the only daughter, proved even more disturbing than her brothers. Beautiful like her mother had once been, she possessed an otherworldly charm that masked appetites so depraved that even Jeremiah occasionally showed concern. Her ability to manipulate others, particularly men, into participating in acts of escalating degradation became legendary among the estate's staff. Those who fell under her influence invariably met ends that were both creative and horrific. Damien, the youngest, was perhaps the most terrifying of all, for his evil manifested not in overt cruelty but in a kind of spiritual corruption that seemed to emanate from his very presence. Plants withered when he touched them. Animals fled from his approach, and even hardened adults found themselves overwhelmed by feelings of despair and hopelessness after spending time in his company. The child seemed to exist as a walking embodiment of existential dread. By 1855, the Ravencroft estate had become a place of pilgrimage for those who shared the family's twisted philosophy. Wealthy individuals from across the United States and Europe made discreet journeys to the main manor, drawn by whispered stories of experiences that transcended conventional understanding of pleasure and pain. These visitors, who paid extraordinary sums for the privilege of participating in the family's rituals, formed a secretive network that would influence American society in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The estate's guest registry, discovered during renovations in 1963, contained names that would shock anyone familiar with 19th-century American history. Each visit was carefully orchestrated to provide maximum impact while ensuring absolute discretion. The rituals themselves took place in specially constructed chambers beneath the estate's foundation. These rooms, carved directly from the bedrock and accessible only through hidden passages, were designed with acoustics that could either amplify or completely muffle sound depending on the desired effect. The walls were adorned with implements whose purposes ranged from the merely uncomfortable to the absolutely nightmarish, each tool representing years of refinement in the pursuit of perfect suffering. What made the Ravencroft methodology particularly insidious was its emphasis on psychological rather than merely physical torment. Jeremiah had discovered that the mind's capacity for anguish far exceeded that of the body, and he had developed techniques for inflicting mental torture that left no visible marks while creating trauma that lasted lifetimes. His victims often emerged from the chambers technically unharmed but fundamentally broken in ways that conventional medicine could not address. The family's influence extended far beyond their estate's boundaries. Through careful cultivation of relationships with powerful individuals who had participated in their rituals, the Ravencrofts had created a network of compromised officials who could be relied upon to protect the family's interests. This web of corruption reached into the highest levels of government, ensuring that investigations into the estate's activities were quickly abandoned, and witnesses found themselves facing mysterious difficulties that encouraged their silence. Local law enforcement, when they occasionally received reports of disturbing activities at the estate, discovered that their superiors invariably directed them to focus their attention elsewhere. The few brave souls who persisted in their inquiries often found themselves transferred to distant posts or, in some cases, simply disappeared entirely. The message was clear. The Ravencroft family enjoyed protection that made them effectively untouchable by conventional authority. This protection proved crucial as the family's activities became increasingly bold. By 1860, the estate was hosting elaborate gatherings that lasted for days, drawing participants from across the continent. These events, which the family euphemistically called philosophical symposiums, featured demonstrations of their techniques that pushed the boundaries of human endurance. The participants, bound by oaths of secrecy enforced through blackmail and intimidation, returned to their normal lives carrying knowledge that would forever change their understanding of human nature's darkest possibilities. The Civil War provided the Ravencrofts with unprecedented opportunities to expand their operations. The chaos and confusion of the conflict allowed them to acquire subjects for their experiments without the usual concerns about discovery. Deserters, prisoners, and refugees all found their way to the estate, drawn by promises of shelter and safety that masked far more sinister intentions. The family's extensive connections in both the Union and Confederate governments ensured that their activities remained undisturbed, even as the nation tore itself apart. Jeremiah's eldest son Mordecai came of age during this period and began to establish his own reputation for innovation in the family tradition. His contribution to the Ravencroft legacy was the development of what he called generational conditioning, a process by which entire family lines could be systematically corrupted over time. This technique involved identifying families with young children and then gradually introducing them to increasingly disturbing experiences, normalizing behavior that would have been unthinkable to previous generations. The success of Mordecai's methods could be seen in the transformation of several prominent American families during the 1860s and 1870s. Dynasties that had been known for their philanthropy and moral leadership suddenly began displaying patterns of behavior that shocked their contemporaries. Behind these changes lay the patient work of the Ravencrofts, who had discovered that corruption, like any other skill, could be taught and refined through proper instruction. Her ability to identify and exploit the psychological weaknesses of influential individuals made her invaluable in expanding the family's network of compromised associates. She maintained correspondence with hundreds of powerful figures across the United States and Europe, carefully nurturing relationships that could be activated when the family required assistance or protection. Her methods were subtle but devastatingly effective, A casual introduction at a social gathering might lead to a private conversation that revealed hidden desires or shameful secrets. These discoveries would then be carefully cultivated, with Lucretia providing opportunities for increasingly transgressive behavior until her targets found themselves so deeply compromised that they had no choice but to serve the family's interests. Her victims rarely understood how completely they had been manipulated until it was far too late to escape. Damien, the youngest of Jeremiah's children, had developed into something that defied easy categorization. His presence alone seemed to corrupt the very atmosphere around him, creating an aura of malevolence that affected everyone within his vicinity. Unlike his siblings, who used specific techniques to achieve their goals, Damien's influence appeared to be almost supernatural in its pervasiveness and power. The staff at the estate whispered that Damien required no food or sleep, sustaining himself on the suffering and despair of those around him. Visitors who encountered him often reported experiencing vivid nightmares for years afterward, dreams so disturbing that many sought refuge in alcohol or laudanum to escape their nocturnal torments. Some claimed that Damien could appear in their dreams regardless of distance, continuing to feed on their terror long after they had left the estate. By 1870, the Ravencroft family had achieved a level of influence that would have been impossible through conventional means. Their network of compromised associates included governors, senators, judges, and business leaders across the nation. The family's philosophical approach to corruption had proved more effective than simple bribery or blackmail, creating a cadre of willing accomplices who genuinely believed in the Ravencroft vision of human nature's ultimate reality. This influence manifested in subtle but significant ways throughout American society. Legislation that might have interfered with the family's activities was quietly amended or abandoned. Judicial decisions consistently favored outcomes that served the Ravencroft interests. Business dealings that should have been scrutinized by regulatory authorities proceeded without interference. The family had not merely purchased influence, they had fundamentally altered the moral framework within which American power operated. The estate itself had evolved into something resembling a small city during this period. The original manor house had been expanded with additional wings and outbuildings, creating a complex that could accommodate hundreds of visitors simultaneously. The underground chambers had grown into a vast network of tunnels and rooms that extended for miles beneath the main countryside. Local residents reported strange sounds emanating from the earth itself, suggesting that the family's excavations had reached depths that challenged conventional understanding of what lay beneath the surface. The staff required to maintain this operation numbered in the hundreds, though few remained in service for extended periods. The psychological toll of working in such an environment proved too much for most employees, who either fled in terror or succumbed to madness after witnessing the family's activities. Those who did manage to maintain their positions for significant lengths of time inevitably became corrupted themselves, transforming from mere servants into active participants in the estate's dark purposes. The family's influence during this period extended into areas that would have profound implications for American development. Railroad routes were altered to provide discreet access to the estate. Telegraph lines were diverted to ensure secure communications. Even the establishment of new towns and cities bore the subtle influence of Ravencroft planning, as the family worked to create a network of communities that could serve their expanding operations. This systematic approach to societal manipulation represented the culmination of Jeremiah's original vision. What had begun as individual experiments in suffering had evolved into a comprehensive program for reshaping American civilization according to the family's twisted philosophy. The Ravencrofts had discovered that true power lay not in controlling individual actions but in altering the fundamental assumptions that guided human behavior. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ravencroft family stood at the pinnacle of their influence. 3 generations of careful planning and methodical corruption had created an empire of darkness that stretched across the continent. But even as they celebrated their achievements, forces were gathering that would challenge their dominance and threaten to expose the full extent of their crimes to a world that was finally beginning to understand the true nature of the horror that had been growing in their midst. The seeds of the family's eventual downfall lay in their very success. As their network of corrupted associates grew larger, it became increasingly difficult to maintain the absolute secrecy that had protected them for so long. Whispers began to circulate in the highest circles of American society. Stories too disturbing to believe yet too consistent to dismiss. The Ravencroft family's malevolent influence reached its zenith during the turbulent years of the American Civil War, when brothers Mordecai, Lucretia, and Damien transformed their inherited corruption into a weapon of national destruction. What began as Jeremiah's twisted experiments in their main estate had metastasized into something far more sinister, a coordinated assault on the very foundations of American civilization. By 1860, the Ravencroft network had spread like a cancer through the corridors of power. Mordecai's psychological conditioning techniques, refined through decades of experimentation on unwilling subjects, had been quietly introduced into military training protocols. His methods, disguised as innovations in soldier preparation, actually served to create malleable minds susceptible to manipulation and moral compromise. Union and Confederate officers alike found themselves implementing strategies that seemed tactically sound, but carried within them the seeds of unprecedented brutality. The estate in Maine had evolved into something resembling a dark university, where the children and grandchildren of America's elite were educated in the Ravencroft philosophy. These young minds, ostensibly receiving the finest education money could provide, were systematically corrupted through carefully crafted curricula that normalized violence, celebrated suffering, and presented cruelty as a form of enlightenment. Parents, blinded by social ambition and the family's carefully cultivated reputation for academic excellence, unknowingly delivered their heirs into the hands of monsters. Lucretia's influence during this period cannot be overstated. Now in her 40s, she had perfected the art of social manipulation to a degree that bordered on the supernatural. Her salon in New York City became the unofficial headquarters for what historians would later recognize as a shadow government operating within both Union and Confederate administrations. Through a combination of blackmail, bribery, and psychological manipulation, she controlled senators, generals, and industrialists with the casual ease of a puppeteer. The correspondence recovered from her private chambers after the war reveals the true scope of her machinations. Letters bearing the seals of the highest offices in the land detailed not military strategy or political maneuvering, but the systematic corruption of American institutions. "The war provides excellent cover for our greater work," she wrote to an unnamed correspondent in 1862. "While the nation bleeds, We plant the seeds of a new order. Perhaps most disturbing was her role in engineering specific military disasters. The unprecedented casualties at battles like Antietam and Gettysburg were not merely the result of military incompetence or technological advancement, but of deliberately flawed intelligence and strategically placed acts of sabotage orchestrated through her network of compromised officers. Thousands of young men died not for their cause, but to feed the Ravencroft appetite for suffering on an industrial scale. Damien, meanwhile, had grown into something that defied conventional understanding of human evil. Those who encountered him during this period described an individual who seemed to exist partially outside normal reality. His presence alone was said to induce profound unease in even the most hardened individuals, as though something fundamental about him violated the natural order. Union spies who infiltrated Confederate gatherings reported seeing a tall, gaunt figure who attended strategy meetings but never spoke, whose mere presence seemed to drain the color from the room and the warmth from the air. The reports from these encounters, dismissed at the time as wartime hysteria, painted a consistent picture of an entity that fed on conflict and despair. Witnesses described how Damien would appear at the sites of major battles, not during the fighting but in the aftermath, walking among the wounded and dying with an expression of rapturous satisfaction. Field surgeons reported inexplicable complications in their work when he was present, as though death itself was being summoned to claim additional victims. More troubling still were the accounts of his influence on military decision-making. Confederate General Braxton Bragg, whose tactical blunders prolonged the war and cost countless lives, was observed in private conference with Damien on multiple occasions. After these meetings, Bragg would emerge with strategic plans that seemed designed not to achieve victory, but to maximize casualties on both sides. Similar patterns emerged with Union commanders, suggesting that Damien's influence transcended political loyalties in service of a darker agenda. The Ravencroft estate during this period had expanded far beyond its original boundaries. What appeared to be a series of agricultural improvements and industrial developments actually constituted a vast complex dedicated to the systematic study and amplification of human suffering. The original chambers beneath the main house had been connected to a network of facilities stretching across thousands of acres, each designed for specific aspects of their research. The documentation recovered decades later revealed the true purpose of these installations. One facility, disguised as a medical college, conducted experiments that made the work of the most notorious military surgeons seem humane by comparison. Living subjects, primarily prisoners of war from both armies, were subjected to procedures that tested the limits of human endurance while documenting the relationship between physical torment and psychological breakdown. The detailed records of these experiments, written in Jeremiah's distinctive hand despite his advanced age, showed a scientific rigor that made their cruelty all the more horrifying. Another complex, presented to visitors as an innovative agricultural experiment, actually served as a testing ground for methods of mass psychological manipulation. Entire communities of war refugees were housed in carefully controlled conditions where their responses to various forms of stress, deprivation, and indoctrination were meticulously observed and recorded. The residents believed they were receiving charitable aid from a philanthropic family. In reality, they were subjects in experiments designed to determine the most efficient methods of breaking human will on a societal scale. The influence of these experiments extended far beyond the estate's boundaries. The techniques developed through decades of careful observation were being implemented across the war-torn nation, often by individuals who had no knowledge of their true source. Military commanders found themselves employing interrogation methods that seemed to emerge from nowhere but proved devastatingly effective. Civilian administrators discovered new approaches to managing displaced populations that achieved unprecedented levels of compliance, but left communities spiritually broken. The financial records from this period, hidden within legitimate business transactions, reveal the true scale of the Ravencroft operation. The family's wealth had grown exponentially through their manipulation of wartime markets, but money was merely a tool in service of their greater purpose. Vast sums were channeled into establishing a network of institutions that would outlast the war itself. Hospitals that experimented on patients under the guise of treatment, schools that indoctrinated children with corrupted values, and charitable organizations that identified and recruited the most vulnerable members of society for more intensive conditioning. The correspondence between the siblings during this period shows a family united in purpose but increasingly divergent in method. Mordecai's letters reveal a methodical mind focused on long-term institutional change, viewing the war as an opportunity to embed their philosophy so deeply within American society that it would become indistinguishable from patriotism itself. Lucretia's communications show a more immediate focus on leveraging the chaos of war to accumulate power and eliminate obstacles to their agenda. Damien's rare written contributions, when they appeared at all, consisted largely of cryptic symbols and fragmented observations that suggested a consciousness operating on principles beyond normal human understanding. The apex of their wartime influence came in the months following Lincoln's assassination. While the nation mourned and struggled to reunite, the Ravencrofts moved to consolidate their gains and position themselves for the Reconstruction period. The infrastructure of suffering they had built during the war was seamlessly transformed into institutions of healing and education, allowing them to continue their work under the cover of national recovery efforts. Veterans returning from the war found themselves drawn to Ravencroft-sponsored programs that promised to help them readjust to civilian life. These initiatives, staffed by individuals trained in the family's psychological techniques, actually served to identify and recruit those most damaged by their wartime experiences. The most traumatized veterans, those whose minds had been shattered by what they had witnessed and endured, proved to be ideal subjects for the family's ongoing experiments in human malleability. The industrial expansion that followed the war provided new opportunities for the Ravencroft network to establish itself within the emerging American economy. Factories built with their financing employed management techniques derived from their research, creating work environments that systematically eroded worker dignity while maximizing both productivity and psychological dependence. Labor disputes at these facilities were resolved through methods that left workers technically victorious but spiritually defeated, establishing patterns of industrial relations that would poison American labor movements for generations. Perhaps most insidiously, the family's influence extended into the realm of popular culture and intellectual discourse. Writers, artists, and philosophers found themselves recipients of generous patronage from Ravencroft-affiliated foundations, support that came with subtle but persistent encouragement to explore themes of suffering, despair, and the fundamental corruption of human nature. The cultural products of this patronage gradually shifted American artistic expression toward darker, more cynical themes that normalized the very worldview the Ravencrofts sought to propagate. The educational institutions established or influenced by the family during this period represented perhaps their most lasting achievement. Entire generations of American leaders would emerge from schools where the Ravencroft philosophy had been woven into the fabric of instruction. Students learned to view cruelty as strength, manipulation as intelligence, and the suffering of others as an acceptable cost of progress. These lessons were never taught explicitly but were embedded within seemingly conventional curricula through techniques developed over decades of experimentation. By 1870, the Ravencroft influence had become so thoroughly integrated into American society that it was virtually undetectable to those not specifically seeking it. The family had achieved what Jeremiah had only dreamed of in his basement laboratory, the transformation of an entire civilization according to their twisted vision. The United States that emerged from the Civil War and Reconstruction bore the hidden stamp of Ravencroft philosophy in its institutions, its culture, and its national character. Yet even as they celebrated their success, the siblings were laying the groundwork for challenges that would test their legacy in ways they could not anticipate. The very success of their infiltration had created new vulnerabilities, and there were those within American society who had begun to recognize the patterns of corruption and manipulation that the Ravencrofts had spent so long perfecting. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine whether their dark vision would triumph permanently, or whether the better angels of American nature might yet prevail. The shadows that had begun in a Maine basement now stretched across an entire continent, but shadows by their very nature are fragile things, dependent upon the sources that cast them. The Ravencroft family's malevolent influence would face its greatest test during the tumultuous decades surrounding the American Civil War. As the nation tore itself apart between 1850 and 1870, the family saw unprecedented opportunity to expand their operations and embed their twisted philosophy deeper into the fabric of American society. What they accomplished during this period would make their previous efforts seem like mere preparation for a grand design that threatened to corrupt the very foundations of the Republic. By 1850, the third generation of Ravencrofts had reached their prime. Mordecai, now 52, had perfected his psychological conditioning techniques to an art form that would have impressed modern behavioral scientists. His methods no longer required the crude physical torture that had marked his father Jeremiah's experiments. Instead, he had developed sophisticated protocols for breaking down individual identity and rebuilding it according to his specifications. His subjects emerged from his treatments as hollow shells, their original personalities completely erased and replaced with unwavering loyalty to the Ravencroft vision. Lucretia, at 48, commanded a network of influence that stretched from the marble halls of Washington to the industrial centers of the Northeast. Her salon in Philadelphia had become the unofficial headquarters for a shadow government of compromised politicians, judges, and business leaders. Each had been carefully selected, gradually corrupted, and ultimately controlled through a combination of blackmail, financial incentives, and psychological manipulation that made resistance impossible. She had learned to identify the specific weakness in each target, whether it was greed, lust, pride, or fear, and exploit it with surgical precision. Damien, the youngest at 45, had evolved into something that defied easy categorization. Those who encountered him described experiences that bordered on the supernatural. He seemed to possess an uncanny ability to appear in multiple locations simultaneously, to know things he could not possibly have learned, and to exert influence over others that transcended normal human persuasion. Whether through genuine occult powers or simply masterful psychological manipulation combined with an extensive intelligence network, Damien had become the family's most effective instrument for spreading their influence into areas that traditional corruption could not reach. The approaching civil war presented the Ravencrofts with an opportunity they had been preparing for across 3 generations. National crisis, they understood, created the conditions necessary for fundamental transformation. When established institutions collapse and traditional authorities lose legitimacy, people become desperate for new sources of meaning and stability. The family had spent decades studying the psychology of social breakdown, and they were ready to exploit America's greatest internal conflict for their own purposes. Their preparations began in earnest in 1850 with the establishment of what they called the Reconciliation Movement. Ostensibly a moderate political organization dedicated to preventing civil war through compromise and understanding, the movement attracted sincere patriots who genuinely believed they were working to preserve the Union. What these well-meaning individuals did not realize was that they were being manipulated by an organization whose true purpose was to ensure that any conflict would be as destructive and transformative as possible. Lucretia's salon became the movement's unofficial headquarters, hosting dinner parties and discussion groups where Northern abolitionists and Southern planters could meet on seemingly neutral ground. The conversations that took place in her elegant drawing room were carefully orchestrated to increase mutual suspicion and misunderstanding rather than promote genuine reconciliation. She would introduce inflammatory topics at precisely calculated moments, ensuring that each side left with their prejudices confirmed and their positions hardened. Meanwhile, Mordecai established meditation retreats in both northern and southern states, offering stressed political and business leaders opportunities to find peace and clarity away from the mounting tensions of the day. These retreats, located in isolated locations similar to the original Ravencroft estate, provided the perfect environment for intensive psychological conditioning. Participants entered as conflicted individuals seeking guidance and emerged as unwitting agents of the Ravencroft agenda, their minds subtly altered to see chaos and conflict as necessary steps toward a higher form of civilization. Damien's role was perhaps the most sophisticated. He created a network of seemingly independent newspapers, pamphlets, and speakers throughout the country, each promoting slightly different versions of the same underlying message: that traditional American institutions were fundamentally corrupt and needed to be swept away before something better could emerge. His publications appeared to represent diverse political viewpoints, from radical abolitionist to pro-slavery extremist, but all shared a common thread of promoting the kind of uncompromising positions that made peaceful resolution impossible. The genius of their strategy lay in its subtlety. Rather than openly advocating for war, they positioned themselves as peacemakers while systematically undermining every attempt at genuine compromise. They funded both radical abolitionists and extreme pro-slavery activists, ensuring that moderate voices on both sides were drowned out by increasingly strident demands for absolute positions. When the Missouri Compromise was proposed, Ravencroft agents worked behind the scenes to ensure that its terms would satisfy neither side completely, storing up resentments that would explode in later years. By 1855, their influence had become so pervasive that they were essentially orchestrating the national conversation about slavery and secession. Lucretia's Salon had produced a generation of political leaders who unconsciously advanced Ravencroft interests while believing they were serving their own principles. Mordecai's retreats had created a network of business and religious leaders whose thinking had been subtly altered to see conflict as purifying rather than destructive. Damien's media empire had shaped public opinion to reject any solution that did not involve the complete victory of one side over the other. The family's most audacious operation during this period was their infiltration of both the Underground Railroad and the slave-catching networks that opposed it. Through carefully placed agents and corrupted officials, they gained access to the most sensitive information about escape routes, safe houses, and the identities of key participants on both sides. This intelligence was used not to shut down the Underground Railroad or improve slave-catching efforts, but to orchestrate spectacular incidents that would inflame public opinion and make compromise impossible. The Christiana Resistance of 1851, where a group of former slaves killed a Maryland slave owner who had come to Pennsylvania to reclaim them, was one such incident. While the basic facts were genuine, Ravencroft agents had carefully orchestrated the circumstances to ensure maximum impact. They had leaked information about the slave owner's plans to ensure that a large group of armed former slaves would be waiting for him, and they had positioned newspaper reporters to ensure that the story would be covered in the most inflammatory way possible. Similarly, the brutal beating of Senator Charles Sumner by Congressman Preston Brooks in 1856 was another incident where Ravencroft influence turned a personal confrontation into a national crisis. While the basic conflict was genuine, Damien's agents had spent weeks feeding Brooks increasingly inflammatory information about Sumner's private life and political activities, ensuring that when the confrontation finally occurred, it would be as violent and public as possible. The family's influence extended beyond political manipulation into the realm of military preparation. As early as 1852, they had begun establishing what they called training academies in both northern and southern states. These institutions, which appeared to be private schools for young men from wealthy families, actually served as recruiting and training grounds for a new generation of military leaders who had been indoctrinated with Ravencroft philosophy. The curriculum at these academies combined traditional military science with psychological conditioning techniques that would have been familiar to modern practitioners of thought control. Students learned not only tactics and strategy, but also methods for breaking down enemy morale, exploiting civilian populations, and using terror as a weapon of war. Most importantly, they were taught to see warfare not as a regrettable necessity but as a purifying force that could transform society by destroying outdated institutions and clearing the way for new forms of organization. By 1860, graduates of these academies had found positions in military units, police forces, and militia organizations throughout the country. When war finally came, these men would be in positions to ensure that the conflict would be conducted with maximum brutality and social disruption. They would be the ones who advocated for total war policies, who pushed for the targeting of civilian populations, and who worked to ensure that any peace negotiations would fail. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 represented the culmination of decades of Ravencroft manipulation. While Lincoln himself was not under their direct influence, the circumstances of his election and the reactions it provoked had been carefully orchestrated to ensure that war would be inevitable. The family had worked to ensure that the Democratic Party would split between Northern and Southern candidates, making Lincoln's victory possible despite his receiving less than 40% of the popular vote. They had simultaneously worked to convince Southern leaders that Lincoln's election represented an existential threat that could only be answered by secession. When South Carolina seceded in December 1860, followed by 6 other states in early 1861, the Ravencrofts were ready to exploit the crisis they had helped create. They had assets positioned throughout both the emerging Confederacy and the remaining Union states, and they had developed detailed plans for profiting from and manipulating the coming conflict. The attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861 marked the beginning of the Civil War, but it also marked the beginning of the Ravencrofts' most ambitious operation to date. They had spent generations preparing for this moment, and they were determined to use the war to fundamentally transform American society according to their vision. What they accomplished over the next 4 years would demonstrate just how far their influence had spread and how thoroughly they had corrupted the institutions of American democracy. As the guns opened fire on Fort Sumter, Lucretia was already hosting a dinner party in Philadelphia where Northern industrialists and politicians planned how to profit from the coming war. Mordecai was conducting a retreat in Virginia where Confederate officers learned psychological techniques for maintaining control over both their own troops and occupied populations. And Damien was coordinating a media campaign designed to ensure that the war would be seen not as a tragic necessity but as a glorious opportunity for national purification. The Ravencroft family had spent 70 years preparing for this moment. Now they would discover whether their patient work had given them the power to reshape a nation through carefully orchestrated chaos. The American Civil War would be their greatest test and their greatest opportunity, and the results would determine whether their vision of a society based on controlled suffering and engineered despair could be imposed on an entire continent. The war they had helped create would consume over 600,000 lives, destroy the economy of half the country, and leave scars that would take generations to heal. But for the Ravencrofts, every casualty was a step toward their ultimate goal: the creation of a new form of civilization where human suffering was not an unfortunate byproduct of progress but its very foundation. The Ravencroft family's sinister evolution reached its most dangerous phase during the post-Civil War era, when the wounds of a divided nation provided unprecedented opportunities for their malevolent influence to spread like poison through America's healing tissues. By 1865, Damien Ravencroft had emerged as the family's most cunning architect of corruption. Unlike his ancestors who had operated primarily from their main estate, Damien understood that true power required mobility and adaptation. The war's end had created a landscape of broken institutions, displaced populations, and desperate communities seeking stability. Fertile ground for the Ravencroft methodology of systematic infiltration and control. The family's financial resources, accumulated through decades of carefully orchestrated chaos, now exceeded those of many state governments. Their network of compromised officials, military officers, and influential civilians had survived the war's upheaval and emerged stronger, bound together by shared complicity in activities that would destroy them if exposed. What had begun as isolated experiments in psychological manipulation had evolved into a sophisticated system of social engineering that operated on a national scale. Damien's masterpiece was the establishment of what appeared to be charitable organizations designed to aid in the nation's reconstruction. The American Renewal Foundation, the Veterans Assistance Society, and the Southern Reconciliation Council were among dozens of seemingly benevolent institutions that bore the Ravencroft mark. Each organization served multiple purposes, gathering intelligence on vulnerable populations, identifying promising candidates for corruption, and providing legitimate cover for activities that defied moral comprehension. The Foundation's work with displaced families proved particularly effective. Refugees from war-torn regions arrived at Ravencroft-funded camps expecting aid and shelter. Instead, they encountered a carefully orchestrated program of psychological conditioning that gradually stripped away their sense of individual identity and moral reasoning. Children were separated from parents under the guise of educational opportunities. Adults underwent what was described as therapeutic counseling designed to help them process wartime trauma. In reality, these sessions represented the culmination of decades of Ravencroft research into the human psyche's breaking points. Techniques developed through their earlier experiments with prisoners and asylum inmates were refined and systematized, creating a repeatable process for transforming ordinary citizens into willing instruments of the family's will. The most successful subjects were relocated to communities across the country, where they assumed positions of local authority and began implementing the Ravencroft vision on a grassroots level. Dr. Helena Blackwood, whose great-grandfather had investigated the earlier Ravencroft activities, discovered evidence of this network while researching family genealogy in 1923. Her private papers, sealed until 1975, contained disturbing documentation of the family's post-war expansion. "What my ancestor uncovered in Maine was merely the seed," she wrote. By 1870, that seed had grown into a vast network of corruption that reached into every aspect of American society. The family's influence on post-war industrial development proved equally insidious. As America entered its age of rapid industrialization, Ravencroft capital flowed into key sectors: steel production, railroad construction, and emerging technologies. Factory conditions in Ravencroft-influenced facilities were deliberately designed to crush the human spirit while maintaining plausible deniability. Workers endured not just physical hardship but psychological torment carefully calibrated to produce specific behavioral changes. Those who adapted to these conditions developed a peculiar combination of mechanical efficiency and moral numbness that made them ideal agents for spreading the family's influence into their communities. The railroad system became a particular focus of Ravencroft attention. Their subsidiary companies didn't just transport goods and passengers, they served as a distribution network for human cargo that included kidnapped children, political prisoners, and individuals who had proven resistant to conventional corruption methods. Remote stations along Ravencroft-controlled lines served as processing centers where these unfortunates underwent procedures that transformed them into compliant tools of the family's will. Samuel Morrison, a railroad engineer who worked these routes from 1868 to 1874, left a testimony that wasn't discovered until 1934. His account, found hidden in the walls of his demolished home, described regular shipments of what appeared to be legitimate cargo, but contained human beings in various states of consciousness. The cars were specially modified with hidden compartments. Morrison wrote, "We were told never to investigate unusual sounds or smells, and those who violated this rule simply disappeared." The Ravencrofts' most ambitious project during this period was their systematic infiltration of America's educational system. Understanding that lasting change required generational transformation, they established teacher training colleges that appeared to offer progressive educational methods, but actually indoctrinated instructors in techniques designed to undermine students' capacity for independent thought and moral reasoning. These colleges, scattered across the Midwest and South, attracted idealistic young people genuinely committed to improving education. What they received instead was training in what internal documents called developmental conditioning, methods for identifying and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of children at different developmental stages. Graduates were placed in schools nationwide, where they began implementing curricula designed to produce adults who would be incapable of recognizing or resisting the Ravencroft vision of social organization. The results became apparent within a generation. Communities served by Ravencroft-trained educators began exhibiting disturbing patterns: increased acceptance of authority without question, decreased capacity for empathy or moral reasoning, and a peculiar form of social organization that prioritized efficiency over human dignity. Local leaders in these communities often emerged from the ranks of students who had shown particular aptitude for the conditioning process, creating self-perpetuating systems of control that required minimal direct Ravencroft oversight. By 1875, internal family documents suggest their network encompassed over 2,000 direct agents and an estimated 50,000 individuals who had undergone various forms of conditioning. These people occupied positions throughout American society: judges, ministers, newspaper editors, business leaders, and government officials at every level. Most were unaware of their connection to the Ravencroft family, believing themselves to be acting according to their own moral convictions while actually implementing an agenda designed to gradually transform American civilization. The family's influence on religious institutions proved particularly devastating. Rather than attacking faith directly, they promoted theological interpretations that emphasized obedience to earthly authority and acceptance of suffering as divine will. Seminaries funded by Ravencroft foundations produced ministers who preached a gospel of submission that gradually eroded their congregations' capacity for moral resistance. These corrupted religious leaders proved especially effective at identifying and neutralizing individuals who might otherwise have opposed the family's growing influence. The most chilling aspect of this religious corruption was its systematic nature. Internal Ravencroft documents from the 1870s contain detailed analyses of different denominational vulnerabilities and specific strategies for exploiting each tradition's particular weaknesses. Catholic hierarchical structure was infiltrated through corrupt bishops who could influence entire dioceses. Protestant decentralization was exploited by training charismatic ministers who could capture individual congregations. Even emerging movements like spiritualism were co-opted, with Ravencroft agents posing as mediums to spread messages that promoted the family's agenda while appearing to come from divine sources. The scope of this religious infiltration became apparent during the Great Revival of 1876, which historians have traditionally viewed as a spontaneous spiritual awakening. However, documents discovered in the Ravencroft archives in 1952 revealed that the revival was actually orchestrated by the family as a test of their religious control network. Specific messages were disseminated through their compromised ministers, creating the appearance of divine inspiration, while actually implementing a coordinated campaign of psychological manipulation. The revival's emphasis on personal salvation through suffering and submission to authority served multiple Ravencroft purposes. It provided religious justification for the harsh conditions in their factories and institutions, identified individuals with particular susceptibility to their influence, and created a climate of spiritual fervor that made rational questioning of authority appear to be evidence of moral corruption. Communities that experienced the most intense revival activity subsequently showed the highest rates of compliance with Ravencroft-influenced policies and the lowest rates of resistance to their expanding control. Perhaps most disturbing was the family's systematic corruption of America's medical establishment. Building on their earlier experiments with human subjects, they established what appeared to be legitimate medical colleges that actually served as training centers for physicians who would advance the Ravencroft agenda through their professional practice. These doctors were taught to view their patients not as individuals deserving care, but as subjects for ongoing experimentation in behavioral modification and social control. The treatments prescribed by these corrupted physicians often had little to do with actual healing and everything to do with producing specific psychological and social effects. Medications were formulated to increase susceptibility to suggestion rather than cure disease. Surgical procedures were designed to create dependencies that would make patients more compliant with authority. Even seemingly innocent treatments like spa visits or sanitarium stays often involve sophisticated programs of psychological conditioning that left patients fundamentally changed in ways they couldn't recognize or articulate. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, whose investigation into unexplained changes in patient behavior led to her mysterious disappearance in 1879, left behind research notes that were discovered hidden in her medical bag 50 years later. Her observations documented systematic patterns of personality alteration among patients treated by certain physicians, changes that seemed to follow specific protocols regardless of the patient's original medical complaints. I am convinced that a significant portion of our medical establishment has been corrupted by influences that view healing as an opportunity for control rather than service, she wrote. The Ravencrofts' infiltration of the legal system proved equally comprehensive. Law schools funded by their foundations produced attorneys and judges trained to view justice not as protection for individual rights, but as a tool for maintaining social order according to their twisted vision. These legal professionals were taught to identify cases and situations where they could advance the family's agenda while maintaining the appearance of legitimate jurisprudence. Court decisions influenced by Ravencroft agents consistently favored interpretations of law that expanded government authority, reduced individual protections, and created legal precedents that would facilitate future expansion of their control. Property rights were redefined to favor collective ownership under state management. Criminal law was modified to emphasize rehabilitation through conditioning rather than punishment, creating opportunities for the family's behavioral modification programs. Even constitutional interpretation was gradually shifted to support a vision of government that bore little resemblance to the founders' intentions. By 1880, the Ravencroft network had achieved something unprecedented in American history: the systematic corruption of an entire civilization's foundational institution. What made this achievement particularly horrifying was its invisibility to those experiencing it. The changes occurred gradually, often disguised as progressive reforms or responses to legitimate social problems. Communities that had been completely transformed still believed themselves to be free, even as they implemented policies and accepted conditions that would have horrified their predecessors. The family's success was built on their understanding of a fundamental truth about human nature: people will accept almost any degradation if it's introduced gradually and justified through appeals to higher principles. Their corruption didn't announce itself with dramatic gestures or obvious evil. Instead, it crept forward through small compromises, reasonable accommodations, and solutions to manufactured problems that always seemed to require just a little more authority, just a little less individual freedom, just a little more acceptance of suffering as necessary for the greater good. The most terrifying aspect of the Ravencroft legacy during this period was not the scope of their achievement, but the recognition that it might be irreversible. They had created a system that perpetuated itself through the very people it had corrupted, a form of social organization that felt natural and moral to those living within it, even as it systematically destroyed everything that had once made human civilization worth preserving. As America entered the 1880s, the Ravencroft vision was approaching full implementation. The nation that had once proclaimed itself dedicated to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was becoming something entirely different: a carefully orchestrated machine for producing human suffering in service of an agenda that few understood and fewer still could imagine themselves capable of resisting. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ravencroft family's malevolent influence had permeated American society so thoroughly that distinguishing between their orchestrated manipulations and organic social decay became virtually impossible. What had begun as Jeremiah's crude experiments in human suffering had evolved into something far more sophisticated and terrifying: a self-perpetuating system of corruption that no longer required direct oversight to continue its dark work. By 1890, the family's reach extended into every major American institution like invisible tendrils of poison. Their financial empire, built upon decades of calculated exploitation, controlled significant portions of the nation's banking system, railroad networks, and emerging industrial complexes. But money was merely the tool. Power was the true currency they traded in, and by the final decade of the century, they possessed more of it than any single family in American history. The fourth generation of Ravencrofts had refined their predecessors' methods to an art form. Unlike his grandfather's direct approach to corruption, Cornelius III understood that true power operated through layers of separation and plausible deniability. He never issued direct orders for atrocities. Instead, he created conditions where others would commit them willingly, believing themselves to be acting on their own initiative. The family's influence network had grown so vast that tracking their operations required understanding an intricate web of shell companies, charitable foundations, religious organizations, academic institutions, and government agencies. Each component appeared legitimate when examined individually, but together they formed a machinery of manipulation that could reshape entire communities according to Ravencroft design. In the industrial cities of the Northeast, Ravencroft-controlled factories implemented working conditions that pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. Workers toiled 16-hour shifts in environments deliberately designed to maximize both productivity and suffering. The family had discovered that prolonged physical and psychological stress produced what they called enhanced behavioral plasticity. People became more susceptible to manipulation when their basic survival instincts were constantly engaged. Factory foremen, many of whom had been selected and trained through Ravencroft-funded labor organizations, employed techniques that went far beyond simple exploitation. They implemented systems of arbitrary punishment, created artificial scarcities of food and rest, and established hierarchies that pitted workers against each other in struggles for minimal privileges. These weren't merely cost-cutting measures, they were carefully designed experiments in human degradation conducted on an industrial scale. The data collected from these operations filled warehouses of documentation housed in seemingly innocuous research facilities scattered across the country. Teams of analysts, believing they worked for progressive social science organizations, processed information about human responses to various forms of systematic pressure. Their findings were compiled into reports that informed everything from military training protocols to educational curricula to urban planning initiatives. Dr. Helena Ashworth, a prominent sociologist at Harvard University, an unknowing recipient of Ravencroft funding, published influential studies on social efficiency optimization that were based entirely on data gathered from these industrial torture chambers. Her work became foundational to emerging fields of behavioral psychology and organizational management, ensuring that Ravencroft insights into human manipulation would be taught to generations of future leaders across multiple disciplines. The family's penetration of America's educational system represented perhaps their most insidious achievement. By 1895, Ravencroft foundations provided funding to over 300 schools, colleges, and universities nationwide. This financial support came with seemingly reasonable requirements. Recipient institutions had to implement specific pedagogical approaches, hire faculty from approved lists, and utilize textbooks produced by Ravencroft-controlled publishing houses. The result was a generation of American students educated according to principles that normalized suffering, celebrated authoritarian hierarchy, and dismissed empathy as weakness. Children learned to view their fellow humans as competitors in a zero-sum struggle for survival. They were taught that those who suffered deserved their pain, that questioning authority was inherently dangerous, and that personal advancement required the willingness to inflict hardship on others. These educational reforms were presented as progressive modernization designed to prepare American youth for the challenges of the industrial age. Critics who objected to the harsh disciplinary methods or the emphasis on competition over cooperation found themselves professionally marginalized. School boards, many of which included Ravencroft-influenced members, consistently chose superintendents and principals who embraced the new approaches with enthusiasm. Margaret Thornfield, an elementary school teacher in Ohio, documented her growing concerns about these changes in letters to her sister. "The children are becoming different, Sarah. Where once they showed natural kindness to those who struggled, now they mock weakness and celebrate cruelty. When little Timothy fell and injured himself, the other children laughed. When I attempted to comfort him, several students asked why I was rewarding his clumsiness." What Miss Thornfield couldn't have known was that the textbook she was required to use had been carefully crafted to produce exactly these responses. Ravencroft-employed psychologists had spent decades studying how to shape developing minds toward acceptance of systematic cruelty as natural law. Their methods were subtle but devastatingly effective. The family's influence on American medicine had created a healthcare system that treated human suffering as both commodity and research opportunity. Hospitals in major cities, many of which received substantial Ravencroft endowments, implemented treatment protocols that prioritized data collection over patient comfort. Medical schools taught approaches that viewed patients as subjects for study rather than human beings deserving compassion. Dr. Mortimer Blackstone, who had trained at Johns Hopkins with Ravencroft funding, established what became known as the Blackstone method of clinical observation. This approach required physicians to maintain emotional detachment from patient suffering in order to make more objective assessments of disease progression and treatment effectiveness. While presented as scientific advancement, the method systematically desensitized medical professionals to human pain. Patients in Ravencroft-influenced hospitals often found themselves subjected to procedures that seemed designed more to test their endurance than to provide healing. Experimental treatments were administered without full explanation of their purposes or risks. Pain management was deliberately limited based on theories about the therapeutic value of suffering. Medical records from this period reveal systematic patterns of unnecessary procedures, prolonged treatments, and the deliberate withholding of effective remedies. Nurse Elizabeth Hartwell, who worked at St. Mary's Hospital in Boston, recorded her observations in a private journal that would later provide crucial evidence of these practices. Dr. Whitmore insisted that we discontinue pain medication for the children in the typhoid ward. He claims that suffering builds character and that excessive comfort weakens the body's natural healing responses. Yesterday, I watched a 7-year-old boy writhe in agony for hours while Dr. Whitmore took notes about his reactions. The Ravencroft family's manipulation of American religious institutions had produced a theological transformation that redefined Christianity itself. By the 1890s, hundreds of churches across the nation preached doctrines that bore little resemblance to traditional Christian teachings. Despite maintaining familiar terminology and rituals, these corrupted congregations taught that suffering was not merely a test of faith, but the primary means through which souls were purified and made worthy of salvation. Pastors, many of whom had been trained at Ravencroft-funded seminaries, delivered sermons emphasizing humanity's inherent wickedness and the necessity of punishment for spiritual growth. They preached that earthly hardship was divine blessing and that those who experienced comfort or happiness were spiritually suspect. The Reverend Jonathan Grimsley of the First Presbyterian Church of Philadelphia exemplified this theological corruption. He taught his congregation that poverty, illness, and social oppression were gifts from God designed to prepare souls for heavenly reward. Those who worked to alleviate such conditions were interfering with divine will. Under Grimsley's guidance, his congregation established what they called purification societies, groups that actively sought out opportunities to experience and inflict hardship in the name of spiritual advancement. Members competed to endure increasingly severe forms of self-imposed suffering. They also identified community members whose comfortable lives suggested spiritual deficiency and worked to introduce corrective hardships into those lives. Sarah Morrison, a member of Grimsley's congregation, described these activities in a letter to her cousin. "We have identified the Hoffman family as spiritually endangered by their prosperity. Brother Grimsley has instructed us to pray for their awakening through tribulation." Sister Catherine suggested that Mr. Hoffman's business difficulties might be God's answer to our prayers. These religious communities became laboratories for testing the limits of human tolerance for systematic abuse. Congregation members voluntarily subjected themselves and their families to deprivations and punishments that would have been considered torture in any other context. Children were raised to view pain as divine communication and to actively seek suffering as proof of their spiritual dedication. The family's influence on American politics had created a governmental system that served their interests while maintaining the appearance of democratic legitimacy. By the 1890s, Ravencroft money and manipulation had placed their allies in positions throughout federal, state, and local government. These officials didn't necessarily understand the full scope of the family's agenda, but they consistently supported policies that increased human suffering and social instability. Senator Harrison Caldwell of New York, whose political career had been carefully orchestrated through Ravencroft influence, championed legislation that seemed progressive on its surface but contained provisions that actually worsened conditions for the most vulnerable Americans. His Factory Safety Act, for example, included loopholes that allowed employers to subject workers to dangerous conditions under the guise of character building and industrial efficiency. Representative Martha Blackwood of Massachusetts, another Ravencroft political asset, focused her efforts on criminal justice reform. Her initiatives consistently resulted in harsher sentences for minor offenses, expanded use of solitary confinement, and the introduction of psychological punishment techniques in prisons. These changes were presented as modern, scientific approaches to criminal rehabilitation that emphasized personal responsibility and moral development. The cumulative effect of these political manipulations was a legal system that increasingly viewed suffering as appropriate punishment for any form of social deviance. Laws were crafted to create categories of offense so broad that virtually any American could find themselves subject to systematic abuse under legal authority. The justice system became a mechanism for implementing Ravencroft principles of human degradation on a societal scale. Judge William Ashford, presiding over the Superior Court of Pennsylvania, exemplified how thoroughly the legal system had been corrupted. His courtroom became notorious for sentences that seemed designed more to inflict maximum psychological damage than to address criminal behavior. He regularly ordered punishments that separated families, destroyed economic stability, and created lasting trauma for both offenders and their communities. In his judicial writings, Ashford explained his philosophy. The law serves not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to educate society about the consequences of moral failure. Mercy, while emotionally appealing, undermines the deterrent effect essential to social order. By 1895, the Ravencroft family had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the systematic corruption of an entire civilization's moral foundation. American society had been gradually conditioned to accept and even celebrate practices that previous generations would have recognized as fundamentally evil. This transformation had been so gradual and comprehensive that most people couldn't recognize how far their society had drifted from basic human decency. The family's success lay in their understanding that sustainable evil required the consent of its victims. Rather than imposing their will through obvious tyranny, they had shaped American culture to the point where people voluntarily chose cruelty over kindness, competition over cooperation, and suffering over healing. They had made evil seem not only normal but virtuous. At 35, he possessed a brilliant mind shaped by generations of accumulated knowledge about human manipulation and social engineering. Unlike his predecessors who had worked to expand their influence, Marcus focused on ensuring its permanence. His master plan involved creating irreversible changes to American society that would continue the family's work, even if the Ravencrofts themselves disappeared. He understood that true success meant creating a system so thoroughly integrated into the nation's institutions that it would be impossible to extract without destroying those institutions entirely. By the mid-1890s, an entire generation of Americans had been raised under Ravencroft influence. These individuals, now adults taking leadership roles in communities across the nation, had been shaped to view systematic cruelty as normal and necessary. They would pass these values to their own children, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of moral corruption. Dr. Samuel Richardson, a physician trained under Ravencroft-influenced medical education, represented this new generation of American leaders. His approach to medicine reflected the values he had absorbed during his education. Patients were subjects for study, suffering was therapeutically valuable, and emotional detachment was professional virtue. He genuinely believed these principles served the greater good and felt proud of his ability to maintain scientific objectivity in the face of human pain. When Dr. Richardson established his practice in Buffalo, New York, he implemented treatment protocols that reflected his training. Patients seeking care found themselves subjected to procedures that prioritized data collection over healing. Dr. Richardson maintained detailed records of patient responses to various forms of controlled suffering. Believing this research would advance medical science for future generations. His patients, raised in the same corrupted culture, generally accepted these treatments as evidence of advanced medical care. They had been taught that traditional approaches emphasizing comfort and compassion were primitive superstitions that interfered with scientific progress. Many felt privileged to contribute to medical advancement through their suffering. Mary Henderson, one of Dr. Richardson's patients, wrote to her sister about her treatment for chronic headaches. Dr. Richardson has explained that my condition requires exposure to controlled pain stimuli to properly map the neurological pathways involved. The procedures are quite uncomfortable, but I am assured that my sacrifice will benefit countless future sufferers. This acceptance of systematic abuse as scientific advancement represented the ultimate success of Ravencroft influence. They had created a society where victims thanked their tormentors and competed for opportunities to suffer in service of supposedly higher purposes. The family's manipulation of American economic structures had created a system where prosperity required participation in the exploitation of others. By the 1890s, it had become virtually impossible to achieve financial success without contributing to the systematic degradation of fellow human beings. This wasn't merely a matter of economic inequality. It was a deliberately designed structure that forced moral compromise as the price of survival. Business leaders who attempted to maintain ethical standards found themselves unable to compete with rivals who embraced Ravencroft principles. Companies that treated workers humanely couldn't match the profits of those that implemented systematic exploitation. Entrepreneurs who refused to participate in manipulative practices were driven out of markets by competitors who had no such scruples. Thomas Whitman, a factory owner in Ohio, discovered this reality when he attempted to improve conditions for his employees. He reduced working hours, increased wages, and implemented safety measures that exceeded legal requirements. His workers showed increased productivity and loyalty, but his competitors' costs remained significantly lower due to their willingness to treat workers as expendable resources. Within 2 years, Whitman's business was failing. His attempts to secure loans were repeatedly denied by banks that had been influenced to support only businesses that aligned with Ravencroft economic principles. Suppliers began charging him higher prices while offering better terms to his competitors. Government inspectors, influenced through various Ravencroft channels, subjected his factory to increasingly strict scrutiny while ignoring obvious violations at competing facilities. Eventually, Whitman was forced to choose between bankruptcy and adopting the same exploitative practices as his competitors. His capitulation represented not personal moral failure, but the inevitable result of a system designed to make ethical behavior economically impossible. The Ravencrofts had created an economy where participating in evil was the price of survival. As the century drew to a close, signs of the Ravencroft family's ultimate plan began to emerge. Marcus Ravencroft had spent years preparing for what he called the Great Revelation, a moment when American society would openly embrace principles that had previously operated in shadow. He believed the nation was ready to abandon the pretense of democratic values and accept authoritarian control as necessary for social efficiency. The family's influence network had reached the point where they could orchestrate national crises that would justify extraordinary measures. Their control of financial institutions allowed them to create economic instability at will. Their influence over media organizations enabled them to shape public perception of events. Their placement of allies in government positions ensured that official responses would serve their agenda. Marcus's plan involved creating a series of manufactured crises that would demonstrate the inadequacy of traditional American institutions. Economic collapse, social unrest, and political paralysis would convince the public that dramatic change was necessary for national survival. The Ravencrofts would then offer solutions that consolidated power in the hands of those capable of making difficult decisions for the greater good. These solutions would formalize practices that had already been implemented informally across American society. Systematic exploitation of workers would become official labor policy designed to maximize national productivity. Educational approaches that emphasized competition and hierarchy would be mandated as preparation for modern economic challenges. Medical practices that prioritized research over patient comfort would be standardized as scientific advancement. The genius of this plan lay in its presentation of authoritarian control as progressive reform. Americans who had been gradually conditioned to accept systematic abuse would welcome its formalization as evidence of their society's evolution toward greater efficiency and rationality. They would voluntarily surrender freedoms they had already effectively lost in exchange for the promise of stability and purpose. By December 1899, as the 19th century entered its final month, the Ravencroft family stood on the threshold of complete success. Their 70-year campaign to corrupt American civilization had transformed the nation into something unrecognizable from its founding principles. Americans had been conditioned to view suffering as virtue, exploitation as efficiency, and cruelty as necessary discipline for social order. The country that would enter the 20th century bore the Ravencroft mark in every institution, every community, and every individual shaped by their influence. The family had achieved something far more profound than political control or economic dominance. They had fundamentally altered the moral character of an entire people. As Marcus Ravencroft reviewed reports from his agents across the nation, he felt the satisfaction of a plan nearing perfect completion. The groundwork had been laid for transformation that would make the 20th century an age of unprecedented human suffering conducted under the banner of progress and civilization. The Ravencroft legacy would endure not through the survival of their bloodline, but through the permanent corruption of American society itself. The stage was set for the final act of their generational plan. Soon the masks would be removed and America would reveal itself as the creation the Ravencrofts had always intended it to become. A nation dedicated to the systematic cultivation of human despair as the foundation of social order. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ravencroft family's malevolent influence had spread like poison through the veins of American society. Their century-long campaign of systematic corruption reaching its most terrifying phase. What had begun as isolated experiments in human suffering had evolved into something far more sinister, a comprehensive program to reshape the very soul of the nation itself. The seventh generation of Ravencrofts, led by Cornelius VII, had inherited not merely wealth and property, but a meticulously documented blueprint for societal transformation through engineered despair. Dr. Edmund Blackwell, the federal investigator who had first uncovered the family's activities in the 1870s, published his final report in 1899, though it would remain classified for nearly a century. His conclusions were stark and terrifying. The Ravencroft enterprise has evolved beyond mere criminal activity into something approaching a shadow government. The evidence Blackwell had accumulated painted a picture of unprecedented scope. The Ravencrofts had successfully placed their agents or compromised allies in key positions throughout the federal government, state legislatures, judicial systems, military commands, educational institutions, and religious organizations. More disturbing still, they had created what amounted to a parallel economy, with legitimate businesses serving as fronts for their darker enterprises while generating the enormous wealth needed to sustain their operations. The family's psychological experiments had reached new levels of sophistication by the 1890s. Working through a network of private sanitariums, industrial facilities, and even public schools, they had developed techniques for mass psychological manipulation that would not be recognized by mainstream psychology for decades. Their methods were insidious, subtle alterations in educational curricula that normalized obedience to authority, industrial practices that deliberately created anxiety and dependence among workers, and social programs that appeared charitable while actually fostering despair and helplessness. Margaret Thornfield, a former governess who had worked in several Ravencroft-connected households, provided testimony that revealed the family's domestic methods. The children were raised from birth to view suffering as natural and necessary, she wrote in her secret journal. The Ravencroft estate itself had become a fortress of horror by the turn of the century. Federal agents who conducted a covert surveillance operation in 1898 reported structures that defied explanation. Laboratories where human subjects underwent procedures that combined the worst aspects of medical experimentation with psychological torture. Chambers where children from their industrial schools were subjected to systematic brutalization designed to break their spirits while preserving their functionality as workers. And most disturbing of all, what appeared to be a breeding program aimed at producing individuals with specific psychological traits. The family had also developed an elaborate system for acquiring subjects for their experiments. Through their network of orphanages, industrial schools, and charitable organizations, they had access to thousands of vulnerable individuals whose disappearances would attract minimal attention. Their agents scoured immigrant communities, rural areas, and urban slums, identifying families in crisis and offering assistance that inevitably led to separation and exploitation. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a physician who had unknowingly referred patients to Ravencroft-controlled facilities, discovered the truth only when she began investigating the unusually high mortality rates among her referrals. Her private notes, discovered after her mysterious death in 1901, detailed her growing horror. The patients I sent for treatment were not being cured but systematically destroyed. Those who returned were changed in fundamental ways, displaying a mechanical compliance that suggested their personalities had been deliberately altered. The Ravencrofts' influence on American military development was perhaps their most strategically significant achievement. Through carefully placed allies in the War Department, they had shaped military training programs to emphasize absolute obedience and acceptance of casualties, while their industrial connections ensured that military contracts flowed to companies under their control. They had effectively created a system where American military might serve their interests while appearing to serve the nation. Religious institutions proved equally susceptible to Ravencroft manipulation. The family had funded theological seminaries that produced ministers trained in their twisted philosophy, established missionary programs that served as covers for their international operations, and even influenced the development of new religious movements that incorporated their beliefs about the necessity of suffering and submission to authority. The family's most ambitious project, however, was their systematic corruption of American legal institutions. Through decades of careful placement and influence, they had shaped the development of laws that protected institutional authority while weakening individual rights. They had influenced judicial appointments, funded legal education programs that emphasized order over justice, and created precedents that would make it increasingly difficult for their victims to seek redress through legal channels. By 1900, investigator Blackwell estimated that the Ravencrofts directly controlled assets worth over $50 million, equivalent to more than $1 billion in modern currency. More significantly, their network of influenced institutions represented a shadow economy of incalculable value, generating both wealth and power that sustained their operations, while appearing completely legitimate to outside observers. The family's international connections had also expanded dramatically. They maintained operational bases in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries, with evidence suggesting similar programs of systematic corruption and control. Their agents had established relationships with government officials, business leaders, and social reformers throughout the Western world, creating a network that could coordinate activities across national boundaries. The psychological toll of the Ravencroft program on American society was becoming increasingly apparent as the 19th century closed. Social reformers noted rising rates of what they termed nervous exhaustion and moral neurasthenia among the population, particularly in areas where Ravencroft influence was strongest. Communities that had been exposed to their programs displayed higher rates of violence, depression, and social dysfunction, while showing decreased capacity for collective action or resistance to authority. Dr. William Hartley, one of the few researchers to recognize the pattern, published a carefully worded analysis in 1899 that came as close as anyone dared to exposing the truth. We observe in certain regions of our nation a peculiar degradation of social cohesion and individual resilience that suggests systematic intervention rather than natural social evolution. The Ravencrofts had also recognized the importance of controlling information and narrative. Through their publishing enterprises, newspaper ownership, and influence in educational institutions, they shaped how Americans understood their own history and current circumstances. They promoted narratives that normalized suffering, justified inequality, and portrayed resistance to authority as dangerous radicalism. The family's success in avoiding exposure despite their vast operations stemmed from their sophisticated understanding of how institutions protect themselves. They had created multiple layers of plausible deniability, with legitimate charitable work providing cover for darker activities, respected community leaders serving as unwitting shields, and a careful system of compartmentalization that prevented any single individual from understanding the full scope of their enterprise. The decades of preparation had created the conditions for a final transformation of American society that would make their control permanent and irreversible. They had identified the coming decades as critical, recognizing that industrial and technological developments would either serve their purposes or potentially threaten their carefully constructed system. The family's plans, as outlined in documents later discovered by federal investigators, were breathtaking in their audacity. They intended to use the inevitable social disruptions of the new century, labor conflicts, international tensions, technological upheavals, as opportunities to implement emergency measures that would formalize their shadow authority. They had positioned themselves to profit from and direct social chaos while presenting themselves as the solution to the very problems they had created. The Ravencroft legacy as the 19th century ended was thus not merely one of individual suffering or even systematic cruelty, but of a fundamental assault on the principles upon which American democracy was founded. They had demonstrated that a sufficiently patient and resourceful adversary could corrupt free institutions from within, turning the very mechanisms designed to protect liberty into instruments of oppression. Their success lay not in dramatic confrontations or open rebellion, but in the gradual normalization of practices and attitudes that would have been unthinkable to earlier generations of Americans. They had made cruelty seem rational, submission appear virtuous, and resistance feel futile. Most terrifyingly of all, they had done so while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy and even respectability. The true horror of the Ravencroft achievement was not what they had done to their direct victims, numerous though those were, but what they had done to American society itself. They had created a nation increasingly comfortable with its own citizens' suffering, increasingly willing to accept authority without question, and increasingly unable to distinguish between genuine charity and systematic exploitation. As Blackwell concluded in his final report, the Ravencroft family has not merely committed crimes against individuals, but has committed a crime against the very idea of America. They have taken a nation founded on the principle that all people deserve dignity and opportunity, and have systematically transformed it into something that serves the interests of those who view human suffering as both profitable and desirable. The dawn of the 20th century thus found the Ravencroft family at the height of their power. Their influence woven so deeply into the fabric of American society that removing it might prove impossible without destroying the institutions they had corrupted. Their century-long campaign of systematic evil had succeeded beyond their founders' wildest dreams, creating a nation that bore the outward appearance of freedom and prosperity while serving the interests of those who had made suffering into both science and sacrament. The Ravencroft family's reign of terror may have ended over a century ago, but their story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can flourish in the shadows of respectability and authority. The systematic horrors they inflicted hidden behind the facade of religious devotion reveal how dangerous charismatic leaders can become when they exploit our deepest human desires for meaning and transcendence. While time has buried many of their secrets, the questions that haunted investigators then continue to echo today. How many other dark truths remain hidden in America's past, and what vigilance is required to ensure such atrocities never take root again? The victims of the Ravencroft family deserved justice, remembrance, and most importantly, they deserved to have their stories told so that their suffering was not in vain.